Hello, my name is Afreg. I'm the chair of the Peace Action Network, and I'm here with Art DeFehr, who will be interviewed later on by Tracy Koga. And this shift video is part of a number of shift videos and GCCs leading to the Peace Action Network Summit in the Vatican next year, as well as European Impact Summit in Europe next year as well. Thank you.
Well, it's so nice to sit down with you, Art. First of all, tell me a little bit about your background and how you came into YPO. I think since 1984 you've been a member of Young Presidents Organization.
Well, I'm in business, as you're aware. I'm the executive chairman of Palliser Furniture, formerly CEO in my younger days. But you're supposed to qualify for YPO as being president or similar by the age of 40. That was not my position. I was actually doing international work at that time. So at the age of 39, I had a role with the United Nations in Somalia as head of the UN refugee work in Somalia at 39. And apparently that's an ambassador level position, and that also qualifies for YPO. So unlike most YPO members, I came in actually as a human rights worker, not as the CEO of a company.
And what, I guess, fascinated you about this? And I mean, you worked with refugees since 1972 from Bangladesh, Somalia, Cambodia, the Soviet Union, and still active. And now we'll get into the real meat of what the real controversy is. But for you, Art, what is so important about human rights for you?
Well, I grew up in a home where, as others, Canadians as well, but my family in particular, virtually every member had a refugee background. My grandparents, my mother came through China from the Soviet Union, my father from there via Mexico, my stepmother, my son-in-law, both of my daughters. So we're all refugees other than myself in the family. So I was raised on those stories. I got involved early in the human rights side. I was in the South in my student days. I actually marched with Martin Luther King on the big Selma march. So I kind of got into it early, and I had an FBI record at the age of 22 for human rights work. So I'm proud of that background.
No doubt. All right, so let's get into it. Refugees, migration, immigration, my goodness, has been in the news and is such a controversy. What has changed?
Well, I think the thing about migration is, we'll come into what has changed. It's more complicated, but I think the point is migration is not a new phenomenon. And the UN gives out statistics just recently that says 3.5% of the world's population lives in countries other than where they were born. If you go back 100 years, they say that number was about 3%. So it's not a particularly new phenomenon. So you have to ask what is changing. And I think what was changing in earlier times, if you think pre-World War II, most movement of people would not be recorded as migrants in the same way. They were moving within empires. So if a person moved within a British Empire, it made no consequence, and they also had no rights. They had things like the Ottoman Empire, which were a lot of what we call migrants today in Syria and Turkey, were simply movements within the Ottoman Empire, or the Soviet Union, or the British India. So I think if you go pre-World War II, migration was an internal phenomenon that was not recorded. Since then, the breakdown of empires of all kinds, not only the British, but also the Ottomans and the Soviet Union, has produced a lot of hard borders, smaller borders, harder borders. And a lot of those countries, just because they're borders doesn't mean you get migration, but you also get a lot of states not doing so well. So now you get a failed state. So when you move from one across the border in West Africa, now it's an international migration. In British Empire days, nobody noticed.
Wow. So why are these changes newsworthy, and why should we care, and everything else?
Well, today they have more consequences. I think in again, probably in going back half a century or more, if people were hungry and there was a famine, mostly they just died and nobody paid much attention. And I think today every single thing is, is a murder on the London Bridge of 4 people. It's global news. I think so. I think a lot of the way news occurs and the smaller borders, it creates a lot of, simply we're aware of the things. But it's more than that as well. I think in current times, when people move across border, we're aware of it, but also people feel more threatened. We feel more threatened in terms of when there's large movements of people, of our identity, what it does to our culture. And so the impact or the felt impact is much greater than it was before.
Okay, so what is the true definition of refugee? And do we really understand that?
Well, people throw these words around. You get refugees, you get migrants and undocumented migrants, all these kind of words. Refugee is actually a very technical term, and technical in the sense that it's governed by the UN Convention on Refugees, 1951 or so. And it's a post-World War II phenomenon, and basically it was European-oriented after World War II. And the idea was, the definition of a refugee is that you have to cross a border, you have to then be accepted by the country that you're in. They declare you a refugee. You're not automatically a refugee, and it's based on certain things like discrimination, politically or on persecution, certain reasons. So in today there's 75 million people that are refugees or refugee-like. Of those, only 15 million are actually declared refugees because the rest have not been declared. Think of Venezuela today. The people out of Venezuela, 4.3 million, are not technically refugees because Colombia and others don't declare them refugees. The people in Lebanon from Syria are not technically refugees. The reason for that is if a government declares them to be refugees, that implies all kind of rights on the host government or obligations. So governments don't want to declare refugees.
So Art, what is your opinion, or I guess your thoughts on North America in regards to the refugee and immigration situation?
Well, I think I appreciate that you use the word North America. I think that we have to look at the situation as a North American problem and not as a particular border problem. And if we would, I think we'd get a lot further. Just as for facts, at the U.S.-Mexican border, if you take the last 10 years, the net movement has actually been south, not north. People don't always realize that. So it isn't simply, the narrative isn't always clear. But I think what's happening in North America is that if you have parts of North America which are either underperforming economically or dealing with the consequences of the drug epidemic and things like this, you're going to get consequences which result in migration. And so I think that collectively in North America, we have to look at, if we don't solve the problems in Honduras, they will hit us somewhere else. So the point is you can't close borders if you've got sort of a fever somewhere down somewhere else. So the first thing we have to together all accept the fact that North America is really one place. And if we don't solve the problems in part of it, you'll have consequences. So that's the first part. The other part is, I think for the YPO members, is that people are looking for two things. One, they're looking for safety, and the other looking for security. Security means jobs. I want to take care of my kids and that kind of thing. And what people may not know right now is that there's an interesting development going on in Mexico, where Mexico has been granting asylum more generously. And in fact, a lot of the number of people who are staying in Mexico and getting jobs actually exceed or almost approach the global refugee flow that's being resettled. And I happen to be personally involved in that. And what's interesting about that, it's a private sector solution, which is what YPO is all about. And because these people are saying, I don't want to be in a refugee camp, I don't want welfare, like give me safety and give me a job, I'll take care of my family. So people are coming to the border, being resettled in the companies in northern Mexico. I suspect many YPO members have factories in over there. And they're being settled and disappear into society, they're given citizenship. That to me is part of a solution, not the only solution. First, you want them to stop leaving Honduras, but then the point is the private sector can also play a role, the refugees, when you meet a refugee, the first thing they say, don't give me welfare, don't give me a camp, give me a job and give me security for my family.
Wow. So would this be considered some of the action that you're taking personally?
Well, I'm involved personally in this. My company is, and I think many YPO members' companies could well. It's a very particular scene, but I would say that again, it's what action you take as an individual member. I would again go back to YPO, that YPO should promote understanding of these policies, and there's a lot of also private sector. Globally there's a move at different levels at the UN. There was a World Bank conference called the Refugees and the Private Sector in last June. And there's events like this. This is fairly new, where the global players are recognizing that actually the private sector and jobs are a big part of the solution. So I would encourage YPO to educate itself and to become a participant in these events. These are events at which they can come and be speakers and participate and shape policy as well.
And it's an exciting time to be part of a change, right? And secure a future.
So there's good things going on, and I think YPO can be a player in these events.
So the ones that are undeclared refugees, they have no rights, or what governs them?
Well, they often are. You often on the ground maybe can't tell the difference, but so it depends on the host country. So Lebanon overall allows people to live there. Syria has a lot of people who are not necessarily refugees, so their situation may or not be different. But in many cases, they don't have the rights. And it's really a broader question, is that it's not only the refugee situation, is that governments really don't want the UN or other agencies to talk about the rights of migrants or refugees generally. And the reason for that is that it creates obligation that if you didn't do something, now you're held to account. So there actually is no governance globally for migrants, period. So for example, when there's 20 million migrants in the Middle East working under conditions which some people would call modern slave labor, there's no global standards for what that kind of labor should do. So in many other examples like that, so really there is no global system of governance for migrants because governments don't want that.
That is scary.
Well, it is. If you're a migrant, you basically have very few rights. You take what you can get. But so the rights, the people going into Europe, some governments like Germany have accepted some as migrants, but the rest are kind of subject to deportation or worse.
Well, let's switch it now to our home country, Canada. How do we stand on this whole playing field of immigration and refugees?
Well, Canada has I mean, if you all can always look back at different points in time. Canada in its history, I mean, has had some of the same discriminatory policies we accuse others of. I mean, we had exclusion acts for, the reason my grandfather ended up in Mexico is because I'm Mennonite background, and we were excluded during a period in the 20s that we couldn't come, so they ended up in Mexico. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, we had different versions of that. But I'd say Canada has made a lot of progress, and so if you take the present situation, I think we do much better than the average. Mm-hmm. But I think the key thing about migration that Canada has done is we've recognized that migration is a good thing, and we manage it. And that's often understood, the idea that migrants should be accepted just because they're migrants. It's a wonderful position, and one could say, well, Art, you should support every migrant, every refugee. The reality is our ability to manage huge flows of people are a challenge. I'll just give you one statistic. We hear a lot about resettlement. Canada has a resettlement policy. We resettle about 40,000 a year. Globally, you'd be surprised that total resettlement is not more than about 100,000 a year out of 75 million. That means basically resettlement is not a strategy used very often. And so you can't look upon that as what the strategy is. But what Canada's done is we have managed the flow. We have a consensus that they will come in. Mm-hmm. And we're actually quite restrictive. We pick people based on education. We don't have open borders, but we have a very large program so that overall it does accept a lot of people. So my view is that you need managed programs, not open borders.
Mm-hmm. So what is the right or wrong approach to migrants and refugees, and as a person, as an individual, trying to live in your community? I mean, it's all like we're always so friendly and we welcome everybody.
Well, let's take two approaches. First of all, let's step back and take the human element out of it. On a purely demographic basis, Canada this next couple of years is going to bring about 1% migrants into the country. To put that in perspective, America does about 0.2%. Europe is a little different. We can come back to that. But the point is, at 1% immigration, our labor force actually stays flat. So it's not so much that we're being nice to migrants. If we don't bring in migrants, we will have a declining labor force, which has economic consequences. That's nothing to do with human rights, just purely economic. So the problem, if you look at our neighbor to the south, the Americans, they have not they have not come to terms with the fact that they actually need an immigration policy similar to Canada's. Not because they're nice or anything, just because it's actually good politics. Europe's a little different. Europe with the European community is, as they added new countries, if you look at Germany and France, these need people, but they added in the last two decades, they added countries like the Baltics and the Balkans. I was in Romania recently, and most of these countries have, in the last 2 decades, have lost 20% of their population to the strong central places like Britain, Germany, and France. So they've internally had the migration flowing through that mechanism, and the countries which lost the people at this stage don't have the development opportunity. So they're managing it quietly internally, whereas in Canada and America we have to manage outside of our borders.
So how do you take the whole controversy out of this? I mean, you kind of put it down as like, this is economics, this is what it is, but we can't.
No, the other side which we should talk about is the fact that migration has other consequences, and the consequence is that the people that come, probably because of the world the way it is, the transportation is easier, and in fact the place where there's problems are places where, let's say, people are more different whether it's religion, more different whether it's cultural background, more different racism, whatever you want to do. They are perceived as more different. So when you bring in large numbers of them into a society which has a sense of who they are, right or wrong, good or bad, but they have a sense of this is who we are as a people, and they feel challenged, and especially when people come in, maybe in uncontrolled flows, and you get whatever name you want to call it. The term we use now is populism. You can have populism on the left, populism on the right, but in this case it's on the right. And the idea is that it becomes a reason to protect identity, and you get governments which in fact have other policies as well. So I think the lack of management of refugees, migrants also can have very negative consequences politically. So that's why I say you don't actually manage it just because you want to be nice to people. You manage it also to protect your political understanding of yourself and your society. So I think it's both a selfish and an unselfish rationale.
Well, and you mentioned too, there's no global governance for this. What, in your opinion, needs to happen to even start the ball rolling into some sort of governance globally?
Well, I think part of the long-term answer is that most people need to stay close to where they are. You can't solve you can't solve the climate problem and every political problem by moving millions of people. Well, if you're not going to move them, then you better make it possible for them to stay where they are, which means economic development, which means climate management. It means population management in some countries, which often means the education of women. So it means all the things which allow people to stay where they are, and you can't, and then you can expect more of them to. You can say stay where you are because things are okay there. So I think that's at the big scale. That's the answer. At the governance scale, there probably should be more governments, and there are some things. There was a compact on migration that went through the UN system in 2017. December this year, there will be what they call Refugee Days, and these are actually the first of their kind, where the global community gets together and actually officially talks about it in a place like Geneva. Till now, they have actually, they want to talk about refugees in Ecuador or in Bangladesh, and don't bring it too close to home. So there is some movement on the subject, but I think there's lots to go. But I also say for the rest of us, I think part of the thing is understanding is education. A lot of the discussion about migration really reflects paranoia, it reflects lack of understanding, and that doesn't solve the problem. But if you don't understand the fact that we actually need close to 1% of migration, you can't have a proper policy on doing that.
Well, that's interesting. I want to ask you because we also always hear of Winnipeg as being or any North American city as being a melting pot of ethnicities. Do you think that'll happen across the world? Like there will be like China, like it'll be all one will become one homogeneous culture?
Well, I don't expect that. And I think it's often, and first of all, having a melting pot, what term one wants to use, I think the idea that we become societies that become unaware of the other is not realistic. In that sense, I'm very proud of Canada. My own family is multiracial, and so I experience it at individual level. But I think the idea that that societies can become unaware of difference is not realistic. I call Canada an experiment. It's an experiment which is in process. And I think that's why we have to manage it very carefully, that how we bring people, how many, how we integrate them, the policies on inclusion, you know, it's many things. But it is an experiment which will be ongoing. I think if we do a good job, maybe others will to some degree. Countries like Japan and others, I have no idea how they'll ever get to that kind of a place. But I think Canada has a shot. Let me mention one thing is the Canada, about 30 years ago or 40 years ago, we had something called the sponsorship program for refugees. And I was involved in that at the early end. I was at the other sending end of it. I was in Thailand, Laos at the time. And so you look at that, just a program. But the point is we've had 180,000 people come into Canada on that program. If you're an American, that's like 1.8 million in proportion. It's a lot of people. Mm-hmm. It means almost everybody has had a direct or indirect experience of a refugee family to whom they become human beings. They become real people with real problems, real children, and we do protect them because we've got to know them. I would argue that without that sponsorship program, Canada would not have the current overall acceptance of refugees. So programs and policies do matter. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you get the policies wrong, you can't expect people to, jump up and suddenly become wonderful people.
Do you think we could bring back the sponsorship program?
Well, the sponsorship program is alive and well.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, the government has government-sponsored and private. And there's always pressure from the private people. You don't give us enough of the people. So the government is actually proportionally shifting more into the private sponsorship simply because there is a demand for it. And in fact, the privately sponsored refugees perform better than the government.
No doubt.
Because they get more support.
Mm-hmm. So if there was a right or wrong number of migrants or refugees to be accepted into each country, say Canada, US, a European country, mm-hmm. would that be something that we could look at?
Well, I think it depends what your objectives are. I would say Western countries, from an economic perspective, probably, if you think of it in different ways, support maintaining a workforce, maintaining a proportion of young people working compared to retired people, all these. You can do the economics and you can come up with different answers, but probably there is some number which is probably closer to 1% than anything else, which simply provides stability. And so then within that, then you do intelligent selection. An interesting example is students. Both Canada and the US until maybe a decade ago would say students can come here and then have to go home. Canada suddenly figured out these are great immigrants, and we've flipped, and currently most students, if they really want to, can figure out how to stay here. America is still sending them home, to their detriment. These are probably the easiest and best migrants, so you've trained them, you've invested in them, keep them. So there are policies that actually make a difference. Now, not all policies are easy. Mm-hmm. America has issues with the area south of it, but begin by developing that region. We have our own issues. But the point is, there are actually better and worse policies, and if smart people sit down, they can probably figure it out.
If you could change one thing right now, with human rights, with immigrants, with refugees, what would that be?
Well, I don't think it's one thing because every country is different, but I do think that that probably let's bring it a little closer to home. Let's say within YPO. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I want to speak of the whole world, you're giving me a big challenge. But I would say for YPO, I would guess that some of the answers I've given today, a lot of YPO members may not be aware of. I mean, they're experts at a lot of things they do, but you'd ask them, what's the right proportion of immigrants to maintain stability in our society, our workforce? I guess a lot of them would not do that. Well, what kind of policies exist in countries like Australia and Canada for refugees. Again, so for example, the sponsorship program is being taken around the world to other countries to promote it. So I think from a YPO point of view, and I would encourage the group that this interview is being done for, is say let's begin by not telling people what to do. First, educate ourselves, because we all come from different countries, and so I would say, for example, if you're a member in the Middle East, maybe your policies relate to your part of the world, the human rights of the people working there. If you're in Europe, it relates to you're dealing with a different challenge of the Mediterranean. If it relates to Canada, US, we're dealing with the North American thing. So I think begin by educating ourselves so that we can go to our governments and promote good policies.
Making steps, one little step at a time, is all what it's about. But thank you so much, Art,
Thank you,
for
Tracy.
sharing this.